Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Tabman. Welcome to Crimes and Times. We have quite a show tonight, and I think you'll appreciate the expert opinions we're going to get on the show. Before we get to that, I want to thank many of the viewers from last week's show about reformed criminals. I received a lot of messages from you. Some of you kind of surprised that as a retired FBI agent I would have on two ex-criminals, someone I would have gone up against years ago. But life moves on, and you all appreciated the fact that we gave them a chance to tell you about their past, what led to their life of crime, and the fact that they can reform themselves. And almost all of you were very compassionate and appreciative of the fact they found new lives for themselves. So thank you for all that feedback on last week's show. Tonight, I think we're going to have a really big audience tonight because we're discussing something that's been dominating the news and dominating my personal conversations everywhere I go, and probably that of my guests. We're going to talk about the Nunes Memo. We're going to talk about the FBI. We're going to talk about FISA and probable cause, and see if we can't get a really good understanding of what's going on, and you're going to hear it from two guys who really know what they're talking about. These are old two colleagues of mine, former FBI agents that I've worked with over the years, and you should have heard us gossiping right before the show, catching up on some things and talking about the state of affairs. First, we have Wason Dunn. Wason, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Good to be on.
Thank you. And we also have Bobby Chacon. Bobby, good to see you again after all these years.
Yeah, Mike, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, so I want to first, before we get into Nunes Memo, guys, we have to talk a little bit about the FBI because nothing here exists in a bubble. We have to see how does the FBI fit into all this criticism that's being leveled at them and the politics behind it. So even on this show, we've talked a few times about the two prominent figures in the FBI. First is Peter Strzok, who has these infamous texts with his girlfriend, one of the FBI lawyers. Just for the record, I do not know Peter Strzok, and I never met with him. Do either of you guys know Peter?
No.
No.
Okay, so there's no bias here to speak of. So we look at these texts. We see 50,000 texts going to and from, his girlfriend. Wason, what's the first thing that hits you about that 50,000 texts?
Well, first of all, it's amazing to me that he sent that many texts. I don't know that I would send that many in the course of a year. But more importantly, I am amazed at what I consider very naive and very ill-advised actions. Throughout my entire career, I always carried 2, sometimes 3 different mobile communication devices. I had my official FBI one, I had a personal one, and there were periods of time when I carried a third one for sources or other confidential individuals to contact me. Using your official bureau cell phone or smartphone for that type of conversation to me is just amazing. I can't believe somebody would do that. And I'm very, I guess, dismayed that they did that and that it's now become a source of embarrassment for the Bureau.
Right. I think, Bobby, you'd agree that one of the first things we learn as an FBI agent is what you do on your own time is one thing, but you don't do it on Bureau time and Bureau dime, right?
Well, absolutely. And Wason hit it right on the head. In the conversations I've had with guys that are still on the job and guys that are retired, is the first thing that struck me when I heard that is this guy, Strzok, must be new or fairly new. I mean, I don't want to make myself sound like such an old timer, but, I came in before we even had cell phones. In 1987, when I reported to the New York office, we didn't have cell phones. And in fact, I became indoctrinated into the old timers kind of institutional paranoia, because the first time we had anything like that was when the New York office gave us the easy pass to get through the tunnels so we wouldn't have to pay our own money and get reimbursed at the end of the month. And the old timers immediately came out with these Mylar sleeves and they go, "Here, kid, put it in this." And I go, "Well, that won't work." He goes, "Exactly. Pay your money, and at the end of the month," I said, "But this will get me in the lane that I can get through faster." He goes, "Yeah, it'll also tell the Bureau when you're coming and going, because that machine is going to tell them when you paid your toll." So you develop this institutional paranoia. And,
right.
I always had 2 cell phones. I had my personal cell phone and my Bureau cell phone. And it was just a thing. But I think now with the new generation of agents that we all live our lives on this one device, and it has completely blurred the line. And I think that's what that's what you're seeing in this case. I think that the lines have completely blurred because technology is so ever present that everybody's talking about living your life on this one device. And that's what apparently he got caught up doing.
Exactly. And Bob, I want to follow up with one more thing with you, because you and I worked together in the New York City office. We were street agents together, different squads, but we worked at the same time. We know that he was having this affair with another FBI employee, and we could all pass moral judgment on that, and I think people do. But you're allowed to have an affair as long as it doesn't, you don't carry it on a bureau time. But does that really reflect on his ability as an agent, the fact that he was having an affair? What's your thoughts on that, given the environment that you and I worked in? I'll explain that in a minute.
I mean, the act of having it doesn't, but we all know that these are secret affairs normally. So what's really going to happen is if he was ever asked about that by bureau management and he lied about it, we have something called henthorn now. And, if he's henthorned, we know that immediately moves you out of any investigative capacity. And that's what happened in this case. I don't know that he lied about it, but he immediately got moved out. When those texts came to light, he immediately got moved over to human resources, a non-investigative capacity. So in my mind, he may have fallen under henthorn, which is now, when an agent gets henthorned, it means they've committed a violation of, integrity that could then be used by a defense attorney on cross-examination later on in any, testimony that they might give. That has to be turned over to the defense attorney. So, it's problematic. It's not, the Bureau's always taught us, the wrong act is wrong, but it's even more wrong to lie about it and to try to hide it. And that may be what happened in this case. I don't know that, but normally an affair is something you definitely lie about, especially to your spouse, obviously, and try to keep it quiet to everyone else.
Absolutely. But, again, and I mentioned this in my first book, and Bobby, you'll know what I'm talking about. But, I worked when I was on the street in New York around an environment that was just rampant with extramarital affairs. Especially someone you and I have already talked about, a mutual friend of ours. But the bottom line is, when the work needed to be done, the work got done. And, I needed my partner. He was there. If I said be there 5 a.m., he was there at 5 a.m. So, this maybe immorality of his behavior doesn't always necessarily spill over to the work. Agreed?
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. And like I said, that's why I mentioned henthorn. It's only to the point where it affects your work. And that's why henthorn came in, because it'll affect your work. And that's why I bring it up. If he was henthorn, if not, it's like you said, it's just a lapse of judgment, lapse of moral judgment, which we all have. I mean, I've had them myself in my life. So I would never judge you on that, judge someone on that, or say his ability to do the work has been affected. It just comes into play with his integrity and whether he can maintain that, when he testifies.
Right. Wason, so Strzok has this deep bias against Trump. Does that mean he shouldn't have worked on the case at all?
Well, if in fact his bias was such that it would interfere with his ability to work on the case, then yes, absolutely, he should have recused himself. He should have let people know, I'm probably not the right person to work this matter. But that's the big unanswered question. While I find his actions so far, as reported in the press, to be very disturbing, we really don't know at this point whether they affected his objectivity as an investigator. And as the two of you were talking about, having an extramarital affair and even the unwise and really unprofessional use of the Bureau's cell phones does not necessarily mean he can't be a good investigator. It does certainly raise questions about his judgment. But if, in fact, his biases were such that he could not objectively conduct an investigation, he should not have been involved.
All right, but now, Wason, on this question, and put on your inspector hat, and just for the audience's sake, Wason and I were inspectors together, which meant we were what we call the land of second guessers. We went out to offices and assessed them and, looked for things that weren't right, things that weren't working well, and try to correct them. So, Wason, he makes all these texts, not intending for them to be public, but putting them on a bureau facility, so to speak, their phone, expressing this strong distaste for Trump. In and of itself, should those texts that he did have affected his decision whether or not to recuse himself?
Well, that's the key question, Mike, and nobody's really answered that, and that is what we really need to try to dig down into. The mere fact that he did not like Trump in and of itself may not have disqualified him. Again, it depends on whether his objectivity as an investigator was compromised. And let me give an example of that. During various points in my career, I was involved with task forces investigating, in some cases, violent gangs, in other cases, the human trafficking and the exploitation of minors. I don't know of any FBI agent that would like a human trafficker, a pimp, somebody who's exploiting a young child. And I would say most agents would probably detest somebody like that. However, that did not interfere with their objectivity in order to conduct an actual investigation. So that's the key. Everybody has biases. The key is whether or not his biases affected his ability to conduct an impartial and fair investigation. And that's what we need to try to do, or whoever is conducting the investigation needs to drill down into. That's one of the things that I also just wanted to comment on. There are a lot of people out there offering commentary on one side or the other of this issue and in favor of or against the FBI and against the individuals involved. But most of the people offering commentary do not have access to the facts. I certainly don't. So it's very difficult for me to say conclusively whether or not his impartiality and his objectivity as an investigator was compromised.
Okay, Bobby, your opinion. Should he have recused himself?
I agree that we don't have enough information, but there does seem to be, because it wasn't only his biases, and his mistress also had her strong biases, and these were pretty vociferous biases. I mean, you see some of how they describe Trump and things like that, but beyond their opinions, there seems to be some language, and we know that whatever they texted, they probably talked about in person more, or voice, over the phone more, and certainly in person more. They do skirt very close in some of these texts to indicate that, not that they were going to take action, but when they start talking about having an insurance policy or things like that, or we got to talk to the gang about it, it gives the people that want to see some bad actors here, it gives them enough fodder to follow up on it. And it would certainly give me, as a defense attorney for any defendant that might come out of this case, some leeway already to kind of pull on those strings, because beyond just saying, I don't like this guy, and I agree the language is somewhat, nebulous, but, they started talking about things almost in operational tones, or almost in actionable terms. And so, it really makes me uncomfortable when they got into the area of talking about, and it may have been in jest, it may have been joking, it may have been, some type of jokes between two people having a personal relationship. But what really made me uneasy is some of the language that went beyond the dislike to talking about certain things that they may or may not do, in the course of their, government employment. And that's what has me concerned down the road when we find out more. But we do have to find out more.
I'm sorry to step on you there. And also, since I've already said this on other shows, I'll say it again. My opinion, it was the appearance of impropriety, appearance of bias. And I agree that, during my years in the FBI, strongly a conservative Republican institution. My somewhat liberal views were always left me on the outside looking in. I was always a little bit of a square peg. But no one ever questioned agents' ability to do things fairly in a public corruption or any case that had a political overtone. But these two, we have, I think, a senior agent. I'm not sure what his position was. We have a lawyer. They should have one day woke up and said, hey, we have put out some pretty damning, as you said, Bobby, pretty damning statements can be interpreted in a certain way. We've done it, with Bureau equipment. One day it'll be seen. Perhaps we should come clean, say what we've said, and recuse ourselves from the investigation. My opinion, because I think, again, as we said, it's given fodder to those who want to attack the FBI. All right, so real quick on one more FBI thing before we get into FISA. Andrew McCabe, certainly, President Trump's whipping boy. He's dragged his name through the mud. Wason, did McCabe handle everything correctly? Should he have recused himself?
That's a very good question. And first of all, I agree with everything that's been said. I think what has been made public raises some very, very troubling questions. I would just caution everybody, though, to not jump to conclusions yet. Yes, there are questions. Yes, they need to be looked into. But without the facts, we can't come to a conclusion. And in McCabe's case, while much of what I just said still applies, because we don't have a lot of the facts, I will say that I am amazed at the appearance of impropriety. I am really surprised that he did not recuse himself further or did not take further steps when his wife accepted the money to run for office. And while I understand the facts are that he ran those circumstances by the legal counsel and by the Office of Integrity and Ethics, and that he was cleared, I question whether anybody really thought through, okay, maybe legally he was in the clear, maybe ethically he was in the clear, but it certainly creates an appearance of impropriety. And at least during my career, I know that the appearance of impropriety was just as important to be avoided as actual impropriety itself. And in that regard, I am really surprised at what transpired with Andrew McCabe, because regardless of whether there was any impropriety, and I don't know if there was, and again, we're told that the Office of Integrity and Ethics cleared him and said what he was doing was fine. But still, that appearance of impropriety, I think, is inescapable. And I'm surprised that somebody didn't say, wait a minute, we really, this looks bad. Whether it is or isn't bad, it looks bad.
Yeah, I agree. Again, I've said on this show, on other episodes, once his wife took that money, he should have stood up and said, hey, I'm out on both sides. Nothing should pass my desk. Bobby, we got a question coming in. Someone's asking about where are FBI agents, on this? Should they be backing up each other? Other agents are critical. What's your thought, Bobby? Do you think agents are really split on the things that you and I and Wason are talking about? What's the feeling you're getting?
Well, yeah, I think the FBI has a pretty diverse workforce, and I think we have a pretty diverse, and I think it's even more diverse now than it was, when you and I came in, decades ago. I think that there's a diversity of opinion in the FBI, left and right. I think, however, I think that, even people like myself who hold out judgment on some of these things, I think that to restore the integrity of the FBI, sometimes you have to clean house, and sometimes you have to just start fresh. Whether or not the people that are getting moved out did anything wrong or not, as Wason just said, it's the appearance of impropriety, and sometimes that stains you beyond repair. And so I think, the majority of FBI agents that I've talked to and that I correspond with daily say we just need kind of a new start. We need a reset button. We need the old guard that was in there during this time frame to be pushed out. And I think Director Wray, actually, from what I've heard, has voiced that he's going to bring in a whole new team once this whole thing clears and the smoke settles and the Mueller investigation is over, that there's going to be a new kind of higher echelon at the Bureau. And, not through any fault of somebody that gets moved out. It's just that appearance of impropriety needs to be cleansed. And the only way you cleanse that, I think, in this environment. And I think that's what a lot of agents are voicing. Either side that they come down on, they agree that we need kind of somehow to press the reset button.
Right. So I think the three of us agree that this whole conversation we're having now and is being had by the public and the politicians could have been avoided by a little forethought. Just taking a good look at yourself and thinking, this probably is not a good idea. Let me recuse myself, or let me just put it out there in a more open environment. So lack of discretion, but none of us here appear sold on the idea that these agents necessarily were biased enough to do anything illegal or unethical. Fair enough?
We don't, like Wason said, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, we don't know, but we're certainly not ready to jump to that conclusion.
Right.
All right, so moving on, the issue, I want to get that out about the FBI, because I think all of these things that are happening in succession based on maybe some other grand plan. So let's talk about FISA, because that's what the issue is now with the memo, with potential FBI misconduct. Wason, you have a lot of expertise in FISA. Could you explain to our audience just what FISA is?
Well, FISA, FISA, stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that act specifically gives the FBI and other agencies as well the authority to conduct surveillance both on foreign individuals and, under very narrow circumstances, U.S. persons, that is, U.S. citizens or permanent residents, if there is probable cause that the individual involved may be acting as an agent of a foreign power. So it's not unlike a criminal wiretap or Title III, where you have to show that there's probable cause of criminal activity, and that by monitoring whatever source of communications you're applying for the warrant, that you may be able to develop evidence of that criminality. FISA and the FISA court is analogous in that if you believe somebody is acting as an agent of a foreign power and you have probable cause, you can obtain a warrant to monitor that person's communications to develop further evidence to determine whether they are or not evidence of a foreign power. One of the key things to remember, though, just like with a criminal wiretap, a FISA wiretap, all that is required is probable cause, and probable cause does not mean certainty. So if you have probable cause, which is, more than 50% believe, if you want to look at it that way, but not 100%, it's somewhere between the 50 and 100%, then you have the authority to get the kind of warrant that you're seeking.
Right, and let's make everyone understand, we are talking about wiretapping, eavesdropping on their communications, one of the most intrusive investigative tools that we have at our disposal. And of course, we all agree, very important we do it lawfully. Now, Bobby, you and I have a lot of experience on Title IIIs in the criminal side of the world. Again, analogous to what Wason just described, but instead of looking at someone as an agent of a foreign power, we have to show probable cause of what? Can you explain that to the audience? Because they've seen The Wire, they've seen more of that on TV. It might clarify how we actually get to the point of getting court authorization to do that.
Sure. So Title III is what gives us the authorization to listen in on someone's phone calls domestically in a criminal matter. And so when you thought somebody was committing a crime and using the phone as a conveyance of that crime, you fill out, you do your investigation. And part of the application to obtain a surveillance warrant, a Title III intercept, is you have to show you've exhausted all investigative means, other than this, because as you said, it's so intrusive and it so goes against our right to privacy that the bar is really high on these things. And it's for the government to listen in, it has to show a lot of things. And one of them is you've exhausted all other investigative means. That means you've tried to send an undercover in or an informant in, you've done surveillance, you've checked phone records, you've done what we used to call a pen register, which is you've watched all the numbers they've dialed to see who they're calling and how often. So a lot goes into that application. Now, and then you take all of that and you bring it in and you package it and you say, based on this stuff that we know about this person, we think they're committing a crime and we think they're using this particular phone to carry out that crime or partly carry out that crime. And we've exhausted all of these other means, and you have to show that in the application to show what you've done prior to it. So you can't just walk in and say, we think he's, we have probable cause to think he's a criminal, we want a Title III. You have to show you've exhausted all the means, and then the judge, a district court judge will review the application. You stand there, you answer some questions he may have, and then they grant you or not grant you the ability to put a tap on that person's phone.
You bring up a great point, thinking about exhausting other means. Wason, does that standard apply to FISA as well, having exhausted other means of surveillance or getting the information we want?
There is a similar standard. It's not worded exactly like that. And in some respects, it may be a little less restrictive. There is a standard. You have to show what other techniques have been used. Again, you have to have the probable cause. But when you're dealing with foreign intelligence, sometimes, it is, I guess it's you reach the point of exhaustion of other techniques potentially a little bit sooner, because if you can show through probable cause that an individual may be acting on behalf of a foreign government, that clears a lot of bars that you would not be able to clear on the criminal side. So yes, there are requirements to demonstrate exhaustion of other techniques, but they're not quite as stringent. But on the other hand, you have to have probable cause that the person is acting as an agent of a foreign power. So that in and of itself requires, a substantial amount of evidence and information already.
Right, and I think it's important to point out to everybody that probable cause is probable cause. I remember, people say, oh, but it's so easy to get a FISA warrant. It's not, it's so much harder to get a criminal warrant. You don't have the same standard of proof. No, it's the same standard. We're just proving or trying to show probable cause of two different things. One, as Bobby pointed out, criminal behavior, and on the other side, as Wason points out, agent of a foreign power. Still, probable cause is probable cause. So let's talk about the fact that FISA generally, Wason, let me stick with you for a second, that we're going after agents of a foreign power. Carter Page, an American citizen, legal but unusual. How often, I don't mean by numbers, but in your career, have you seen us targeting Americans under FISA? And does it require a higher standard, or is it the same probable cause as if we were going after a foreign agent from a foreign nation?
Very good question. It requires a much higher standard when you're targeting a U.S. citizen or a U.S. permanent resident. The bar is very, very high because the law and the FBI and the intelligence agencies do respect the constitutional protections that American citizens and U.S. persons are afforded. With regard to a foreign agent, frankly, the bar is pretty low there. If you can show that the person is known or suspected to be, for example, an agent of a hostile intelligence service, I won't name any countries right now, but I think we know the big countries involved. If you can articulate probable cause that the person is in fact or suspected to be an intelligence officer, that is enough if it's a foreigner. If it's a U.S. person, then the bar is quite high. You really have to show that they're acting in concert potentially with a foreign or a hostile intelligence service. So in this case, the individuals on which they obtained the FISA warrants, there had to be enough information in there to articulate why there was probable cause that these individuals were believed to be working at the behest of a hostile foreign power.
Right. All right. So, Bobby, we go in for probable cause. Let's use the analogy here, similar to what Wason said. We're going to go in there. We're going to use a very intrusive device to spy on people, as you like to think about it. We're establishing probable cause. In your experience, how often have you used informant information to get a Title III, Bobby?
Oh, I think almost every time. I mean, right. Not just informant information, though. There was a lot of legwork done, and the informant information is fed into a much larger picture that you build in the affidavit. But certainly, unless, and certainly never a single informant. If you had 3 or 4 independently corroborated informants, but you also needed to show surveillance, you needed to show a lot more investigation than just an informant saying, even if the informant had a good track record, a judge, in my experience, would have never given us a Title III warrant just on an informant information. There had to be much more investigative activity, to reach that Title III bar.
Right, and let's just talk about these informants. How often are these informants really stand-up people that we think about in terms of being non-criminal, just really good law-abiding citizens, or are they generally some sort of criminal background? What about your informants? Describe them.
Yeah, they always have. I mean, all my informants almost always had a criminal background because that's who was close to my subjects. I couldn't, they weren't telling, they were talking about their crimes to their Sunday school teacher. You needed to use informants that were almost inside the criminal organization to get you that kind of information, because these criminals just don't talk to non-criminals often about their criminal activity. So oftentimes your informant was somebody either on the inside or on the periphery of the criminal activity, and you had to be honest, with the judge in that, and you had to tell the judge that, and you had to, because if you didn't, you'd get slammed later on by the judge. If it ever came out at trial later on, when you tried to use that evidence, you could have the evidence suppressed or whatever. So, I mean, you had to tell the judge fully about the informant's, record and track record in providing information, how often they were right, if they were ever wrong, and things like that. I mean, the judge would have to assess, the informant, their reliability.
Right. And Bobby, in your years, did you ever know a FBI wiretap to be thrown out in court because of a flawed affidavit?
None of mine ever were, but I
None of mine either, but you haven't even known any in the FBI.
No, I can't, like I said, there might have been, but I can't think of any that I've heard of specifically. And I used to teach legal instruction in the Bureau, and we'd get those adverse cases that we'd have to brief all the agents on. The Bureau lost this or lost that, or the Ninth Circuit or this circuit, ruled against us on this or that. And I don't recall, somebody might find one, but I don't recall a wiretap, a Title III being suppressed.
Yeah, and nor do I. And as you know, in my squad, 7 years working narcotics, we're doing 1 or 2 wiretaps a week. Never did we have any,
Right.
Wason, Bobby's talking about these sources. They're usually bad people. Does that mean they're not reliable and we shouldn't count on what they say? We should just dismiss it? They're not credible. How can we use their information?
Well, that's where one has to keep in mind one of the key differences between foreign counterintelligence investigations and criminal investigations. While what Bobby said is absolutely true about criminal informants, on the intelligence side, oftentimes your confidential sources of information are actually from very upstanding and reputable individuals. Many times it is officials from another government, an allied government. Sometimes it'll be an individual who may in fact be part of a allied intelligence service. In other words, a professional intelligence officer. And then many other times your assets are law-abiding Americans who, for whatever reason, have been targeted by a hostile intelligence service, probably because of their access or because of some special knowledge that they have. So unlike in the criminal world, in many cases, when you're talking about a FISA application, your sources of information, while they are confidential and in fact are classified in most cases, they may not necessarily be unsavory. They may be very reputable people. They may be upstanding people in the community, and they have information about hostile intelligence activities by virtue of their position. And it's important to keep in mind, again, we're talking about trying to identify who is operating as an agent of a foreign power. Well, your foreign powers, your foreign intelligence services, typically are not necessarily going to be looking to target criminals. They're going to target people who have influence, who have access to decision makers, who have access to inside information regarding the government, regarding businesses, regarding the military. So your typical street criminal, if you will, probably is not going to have that type of access, which is why most of your foreign intelligence services and the assets you're dealing with when in trying to counter their efforts are not going to be the street criminals. Now, that's not to say they don't have some unsavory characters. I mean, there are some hostile intelligence services that use individuals as muscle, if you will, as persuaders, if you will, and certainly those people do have a very unsavory aspect to their background. But it's important to remember, many times in a FISA affidavit, your sources of information are actually from reputable people or officials of foreign governments.
Right, and Wason, I'm going to ask you another question about FISA in 1 sec. Bobby, let's talk about, again, on the criminal side, these criminals that you and I have used as informants, and we count on that information to help us get FISAs or I'm sorry, Title IIIs or search warrants. Do they have another motivation other than helping us? Are they self-serving sometimes?
No, they're self-serving all the time.
I'm glad we went down that road. Yeah, okay.
I don't know that I've ever had an informant come in out of the goodness of their heart, wanting to do the right thing for the American public. Oftentimes it's my first big case was a upstanding citizen came in to report this big drug organization in his neighborhood, and he gave me all the names and details of everything, and all checked out. Turns out he was a rival drug dealer from across the street, giving me all the information on his competitor. We ultimately put them all in jail. Right. I let him play me, or I let him think he was playing me for a certain period of time, but eventually we arrested him and we put him in jail as well. They always have motivations. It's very incumbent upon the agent to know the motivations, know how the informant thinks they're playing you. Let them think that, get as much out of them as you can, and then deal with their motivations later on with the U.S. attorney, because ultimately that person might testify, and you get that stuff out there, because just because they have a different motivation doesn't mean they're lying. You still have to check out their information. When that guy walked into me and said he was just a concerned citizen, I then went out and took everything he had told me and corroborated it myself. I ran the records checks. I went to the local police precincts and saw that these guys did have a number of narcotics arrests for street level dealing and mid-level dealing. So I checked out everything.
Okay, hold on, guys. I just lost Bobby. Max, do we still have Bobby on? Is it just me? All right, everybody, we're going to take a break here for 1 second. We had a little
Come on, let's go.
Just a minute, I gotta finish this.
Wait, you're gonna post those pictures of Mary?
Yep. She thinks she's so hot.
But her mom and dad will see them. Her grandmother, her little sister, everyone she knows, it's gonna kill her.
Who cares? Just a couple pictures. It's no big deal.
No big deal? Don't. This has gotta stop.
As an FBI special agent on TV, I've solved strange and paranormal cases in short order. In reality, it takes months and even years to solve complex crimes, including terrorism, espionage, and cyber hacking. But since women first earned their FBI Special Agent badge in 1972, they've caught thousands of criminals. Thank you for choosing this challenging career and for keeping us safe. Happy anniversary.
Shots fired. Shots fired. Officer down.
Okay, and we're back. Weishan, we're still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I think we lost Bobby. I think we lost Bobby. Okay, we lost Bobby, folks. Sorry about that. We're going to try to get him back on. These are technical difficulties that we have. So we're going to keep trying to get Bobby. Weishan, so this kind of led exactly into what I wanted to talk to you about. Bobby was talking about the fact that we use informants, savory characters who have other motivation, always self-serving. Whether it's a narcotics guy turning in his competition, how many mob cases has the Bureau made by someone walking in knowing he's next on the hit list and he wants to protect himself. So we know we have these people serving themselves. Doesn't mean they don't have good information. So the FBI has a Steele dossier. They attach that to an affidavit, says see attached, handed it to a judge and got the FISA, right?
Well, no, not entirely. That's what a lot of people would want you to believe.
Right.
But from what I know, both in terms of what was in the now infamous Nunes Memo, as well as in the yet-to-be-published Democratic response to that memo, and other things I've read, the FISA application did not rely exclusively on Christopher Steele's information. Now, his information clearly was part of it, but it's my understanding there were other sources of information as well. But let's talk just a moment about Christopher Steele, because much has been made about the fact that his information was paid for by the opposition. First of all, it's my understanding, again, that the FISA application for the warrant did, in fact, indicate that it was paid for by somebody who was in opposition to the candidate Trump at that time. I don't know if they named the individual, but it's paid for by opposition research. Secondly, the fact that it was paid for doesn't make it unreliable. I mean, the analogy I use there is if somebody hires a private investigator for whatever reason, let's say it's a divorce case or something, and a bitter battle between a husband and wife who've separated, and one of them hires a private investigator to develop dirt on their spouse, and in the course of that private investigator's actions, he uncovers that the offending spouse was actually involved in criminal activity. Well, if that happened, the private investigator would likely, if he's a reputable guy, turn that information over to law enforcement, and they could use it. So the fact that it was paid for by an aggrieved spouse has no bearing. If he uncovered evidence of a crime, that evidence can be used if he obtained it lawfully and if he turns it over to law enforcement. So the fact that Christopher Steele was paid by the opposition does not necessarily mean that the information was not accurate. Now, it certainly should cause an individual to question the information and to take some extra steps and to maybe be a little bit skeptical, but it doesn't outright mean it's not valid. And the other thing to remember is Christopher Steele, it's my understanding, was a former highly respected intelligence officer of the British Intelligence Service. He was an individual who in the past had provided very reliable information and had very strong professional credentials. At least that's my understanding. So those things combined would cause me to say you'd be obligated to take a look at the information he dug up.
Right. Bobby, we have you back?
Yes, here I am.
Just
Thanks.
to show you guys, you see that, FBI agents? We never leave a man behind. All right? We got him back at all costs. Glad to have you back, Bobby. We're just catching up on the fact that you had mentioned how we have to rely on people's information even when they're self-serving, and we moved over the Steele dossier. So, Weishan, as you were saying, and comparable to what Bobby said, it's just not realistic to think that the FBI looked at the Steele dossier and said, ooh, this looks good, let's go get a FISA, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, there was other information used. They were attempting to corroborate the information that was in the Steele dossier. And it's my understanding that some was corroborated, some was not. And they were still in the process of trying to corroborate more when they applied for the FISA warrant. And again, it's my understanding from what I've read that the application made it clear that some of the information had not yet been corroborated and some had. But again, we're talking probable cause. So the fact that some had not been corroborated doesn't mean you can't consider the information.
Right, exactly. And Bobby, just like in the Title III, we get information from informants, and we can corroborate. As you said, you went out there, you worked hard, you corroborated some. You probably didn't corroborate everything. Does that mean the information was not usable and was not credible?
No, and in fact, that's why you don't rely on a single source for information to get approval on any of these things. It's always a piece of a much larger puzzle. I mean, in this particular case, let's remember the Bureau got a FISA on Page back in 2013. So they must have other information on him. The 2013, long before Steele dossier or any of these dossiers came into existence. So they were looking at him from way back. So they must have had much more information than just dossier. The dossier or Steele himself. I mean, it's just a piece of the puzzle until we get a look at, if we ever do, the underlying affidavit for the FISA. We will never know, but I can almost guarantee that there was a lot more justification for that FISA than just what was in that dossier.
Right, and and also about other information. I know, again, on the criminal wiretap, we have a certain amount of pro forma stuff that we say boilerplate, and one of those boilerplate sentences is that we're not revealing each and every detail we know about the case. We're revealing just enough to establish probable cause. Right?
That's absolutely right there. I can't remember the exact language, but there's like that one paragraph in that first two sentences of that paragraph that actually say exactly what you just related. It's like, this is not everything we know in the investigation. Nor could it be, or nor should it be.
Right. Exactly. Wason, would that same sort of boilerplate language occur in a FISA?
Yes, it's very similar. Absolutely. The thing to remember about FISA is you are still going before a federal judge. It is just a special court, but these are still federal judges. And just like your criminal wiretap, first of all, by the time it gets to the judge, it's been reviewed by countless individuals within the FBI and within the Department of Justice. And each of these individuals, I would hope is seeking to do a good job, because if they don't, it's going to come back on them, as Bobby said. And finally, when a judge approves it, a judge isn't going to approve something unless they're comfortable that it meets the standard of probable cause, because it's their career and their reputation. And the reason I think both of you have said that you don't personally know of any warrant applications that were overturned, I think the reason for that is there are so many levels of review. I mean, I know when I was involved with both Title IIIs and FISAs, multiple revisions, people at higher levels constantly sending it back saying, you need more of this, you need more of that. So by the time it gets to the court, it has been very thoroughly vetted by multiple levels in both the FBI and the Department of Justice.
Right. Plus, you got to think, Wason, Bobby, this was Carter Page. This was a FISA on an American citizen who was part of a presidential campaign. I can't imagine this didn't get the highest level of scrutiny, probably to the director's desk, maybe even to the AG. What do you think?
No doubt in my mind.
Wason?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something anybody would take lightly.
Right. It just gets more scrutiny. All right, let's go now to what I'm getting questions about, the famous Nunes Memo, where he reveals some information. So let me, I'm looking at it now as I talk to you guys. Excuse me for looking down. But they talk about the fact that we have a FISA on an American citizen. We've already discussed how much went into that, not just probable cause, but because of the fact that he was tied to a presidential campaign. And they acknowledge the sensitive nature. The FBI says, please don't do it. You're going to reveal sources and methods. Bobby, you first. You seen the memo? Any sources and methods revealed in this memo?
No, not to my knowledge and my reading of it. And I read it. I don't see what all the resistance was to it. I don't really think the memo serves much of a function or a purpose for anybody, but I don't really see it was very vociferously resisted, and I really don't see the substance in the memo for that resistance. Now, that being said, I was a lawyer before the FBI, and the way when I read this memo, the first thing that it felt to me and what jumped into my head was this reads like a motion to suppress. The memo reads like a motion to suppress evidence coming out of the FISA, which obviously is premature because we don't even have a defendant yet. But this memo actually read to me like a motion to suppress evidence coming out of that FISA, which is a very odd thing for Devin Nunes as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee to be propagating out there. I mean, this is the job of a defense attorney. If anyone ever gets arrested and tried for things that are being proved by evidence that grew out of that FISA, then those arguments would come in to suppress that evidence. But it's a little premature, and it certainly doesn't seem to me like the job of the chairman of the Intelligence Committee.
Right, which puts into question his whole motivation and what role he's playing in this, appropriately or not appropriately. Wason, sending out this memo, I think we could agree they didn't reveal sources and methods, but even so, the FBI probably had other motivation for not wanting to see a memo like this at all. What harm does this memo have just in terms of setting precedent?
Well, I think in terms of the president, it does a lot of harm because here you have one half of the Intelligence Committee choosing to release something that is classified over the opposition of the other half. And if we continually go down that path, the ability to have any kind of cohesive decision making for the good of the country, I think, is potentially made much, much more challenging. With regard to the FBI coming out and opposing it, my personal opinion is that was probably, from a public relations standpoint, not a good thing to do. Because I agree with what Bobby said and what you said. Upon reading what was in the memo, I don't think there were any sensitive sources and methods revealed or compromised. Now, it did provide maybe an insight into the FISA process, which in and of itself could be considered sensitive. But I personal opinion is that the FBI probably would have been better served by, rather than objecting to the memo, just simply saying, hey, we've reviewed the memo and it is selective. It does not present all the facts. And if it's released, we hope everybody will keep in mind that it's selective and somewhat one-sided and doesn't present all the facts.
Well, I think they did talk about sources and methods, which I think all three of us agree was not revealed. But the FBI did talk about the fact that this would, just sort of create the discussion only on one side. But the problem I'm having with this, one, it sets a precedent of now sort of revealing information about a FISA, its mere existence. But now it necessitates, because I think it's clearly politically motivated. You guys may not agree, but I think you do based on what you said. And this necessitates a response now by the Democrats, another side. And how do you respond? You have to give out more information. Now, whether or not that memo sees the light of day, whether the president lets it out, it gets leaked out, I don't know. But they're going to have to come out and say, no, what about this, what about that? Aren't we heading down a dangerous path now of taking what has been sort of a secret process that always needs to be reviewed by somebody? I'm not suggesting FISA and the FBI can run without checks and balances, but we have a pretty good system that's worked. Now it's going public. Is this a precedent we need? At every time there's a political objection to a FISA, it's going to be made public. Bobby, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's just another step in this huge political divide that we've been going down, and we've been getting more divided and more divided. And I think this is just another symptom of that. I agree with Wason that I don't think the FBI should have weighed in at all. This was a political move by a politician. The FBI does its best work when it's out of the spotlight, and I really had my fingers crossed that once the memo was released, the director didn't feel the necessity to then start to get into a political back and forth, and he didn't, thankfully. But the director, I think, would have been better served, and the Bureau better served, just, like Wason said, you make your piece known to the White House. You say, we don't think this should be released. Here's the reasons why. But to go public with it, you can be easily drawn into a very public debate about these things, and it gets very political, and that's not the place that the director or the Bureau wants to be in.
No, and that's been the whole argument of all the things been going on, is the Bureau's tried so hard to remain apolitical over its existence post J. Edgar Hoover. And I think, irrespective of personal biases or, however we are, Republican, conservative, whatever, liberal, the FBI has maintained and done a pretty good job of remaining apolitical, because that's how the agents want it. So I think, right, that we try to do that. This type of work, this type of memo could only hurt. Wason, FISA, now that we put it out there, are any of our sources going to be hesitant to work with us in the future, fearing more of this is to come, or are they, other things may be exposed by either the Democrats or future memos of a political purpose?
Absolutely, Mike, and I think that's a very valid point, and I agree with you. The fact that for political purposes, a decision was made to release classified information in and of itself sets a dangerous precedent, because now there's going to be more and more, if we keep going down this road, pretty soon, every time there's a political dispute, people are going to start releasing classified information, and that would be very, very deleterious. And in this case, I think it's already had a negative impact, because I know one of the pieces and bits of information that is floating out there is that some of the information that went into the warrant came from an allied foreign intelligence service. And from what I've read, that intelligence service is rather dismayed that the fact that they provided information to us has now become public. And that sort of thing is not going to be good for our ability to conduct truly effective counterintelligence operations of the future. If people think that any time there's a political dispute, the information that goes into FISA affidavits or the information that's being developed in a counterintelligence investigation could become public, it will potentially impact the willingness of other governments and other individuals to share information with us.
Absolutely. And Bobby, if you remember, even on the criminal side, we would receive information from other agencies, foreign or domestic, and it wasn't our information to share unless we got permission, right? We had to respect the ownership of that information.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And not only other organizations, but when we went, when classmates of mine that I graduated Quantico with went to New York together, a couple of them went to FCI. They went to Foreign Counterintelligence to work up on the 25th floor. I worked down on the 23rd floor. I was working criminal matters, and I rarely saw those guys. And it was what we call the Chinese wall. We didn't talk about our cases. We didn't talk. I never even knew what they were doing. I didn't know what squads they were on or what their squad did, whether it was Russian or Chinese or North Korea. I didn't even know. And so even within the FBI, you didn't share that kind of information. We were more open with it because we would have to ultimately see the light of day in a courtroom. Those
Right.
guys didn't have that, that consideration, so they could keep all this stuff secret. And some of their methods they used would have been very helpful to me in some of my investigations, but they couldn't share those methods with me because they couldn't allow those to be, put forth in open court. Now what we're seeing is the crossover. Those lines are being blurred because this is a criminal investigation that's using evidence or information that's coming out of the foreign counterintelligence world. And so we're seeing the clash of these two worlds. And when I worked in New York and my friends worked foreign counterintelligence, we just didn't talk about it. We would go out and have dinner or whatever. I could talk a little bit about what I was doing, but I would never ask them. And I totally understood them not talking to me about what they were doing. It just doesn't happen. I didn't have to know that stuff. I didn't want to know it, and I didn't. And that was even within the FBI. So if you do need to maintain those walls, or else things can really go south fast on you.
Right, and you have to be careful. But Wayson, after 9/11, we looked at where information wasn't being shared when it should have. Didn't we find, we being the intelligence community, the FBI, that some of those walls were self-imposed, and we needed to chip away at them a bit so we didn't lose important information where foreign counterintelligence or terrorism would spill over to the criminal domain?
Well, absolutely, yes. One of the big factors that's come out in the aftermath of 9/11 was that many of these self-imposed restrictions that had been applied over the past couple of decades prior to 9/11 really hindered the ability of the FBI and other members of the intelligence community to really connect the dots, as people like to say, because there were so many restrictions. And post 9/11, a lot of those restrictions were removed. The walls came down somewhat. There were still very careful controls. However, it became a lot easier. And I think the proof of the effectiveness of that is the successes we've seen in the past decade in terms of actually identifying and thwarting potential terrorist plots. And that's one of the big dangers, Mike, is that if people now start saying, okay, we have to start putting those walls back up because anytime there's a political dispute, stuff is going to come out in the public, I think that's going to be harmful in the long run.
Right, and I think that's going to be some of the aftermath of this memo. Wason, yes or no? Do you think the Democratic memo is going to see the light of day?
You know, I think it will. I think it will because there is right now I think calmer heads are seeing that the continued partisanship at that level is not good. And my sense is that it may. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, it does still have to be cleared by the president. So I'm not sure how he's going to act. But from what I've read, the Republican members of the Intelligence Committee are supportive of releasing the Democratic memo.
Right.
I have no clue how the president's going to act when it hits his desk.
None of us do, and we're just guessing. Bobby, so when Part 2 comes out, if it comes out, and now we have a bigger picture of the FISA procedures and the information, what's your damage assessment?
We'll have to see. I think,
Go ahead, Bobby.
I think that, it's been said that the Democrats are trying to throw in some classified information that they know the president will redact. So when he releases it, they'll say he redacted some of it. So this is all a political game. It's all political posturing. I don't expect the Democratic memo to be any more truthful or accurate or on point than the Republican was. I think it will leave out certain things that they want to leave out so they can make their counterpoints. And that's why, I hope that the Bureau stays out of this whole mess, because these battling memos are nothing more than misleading political dialogue. And they're cherry picking, just as the Republicans cherry pick for their memo, the Democrats will cherry pick for their memo, and to me, it just serves no purpose.
Right. I got a question here. I'll just answer it real quick. Someone's asking, are wiretaps and FISA necessary? Can we get the same information from searching the internet? The answer is no. There's nothing like hearing it right out of the horse's mouth. Either you guys want to comment on that?
Well, sure. I would completely agree with you. I mean, although you can get a lot from the internet, and investigators do, both on the criminal side and the counterintelligence side now, a truly professional counterintelligence operation is not going to be conducting its business on the internet. And notwithstanding the fact that we had some senior FBI officials texting each other with stuff that should not have been texted, you're not going to find that. A professional intelligence service is not going to be doing that. And that's why you need the authority of FISA, because you have to be able to get behind that wall that's being put up by the professional intelligence services.
Right. All right.
The criminals the same way, Mike. I mean, if you remember John Gotti, he did his walk and talks out on the sidewalk in our day. And, without the use of a Title III, John Gotti may still be the godfather, And so, yeah, sometimes this is what it takes. But because of our liberties, we set a high bar in order to attain those. Right.
Last thing, we have a couple of minutes, you guys. Big question came about, should Christopher Wray resign because the president didn't listen to him? Wason, your thoughts?
I don't think it's time yet. No, I mean, I think Christopher Wray is doing what he needs to do at this point. For him to resign, frankly, I think would create even more instability and more challenges for the FBI because, what the FBI needs now is a period of stability and a lot of transparency with regard to what's going on. We don't need to have more change at the director level, certainly.
Bobby, your thoughts?
We've all lived through something like this when, Director Free turned in his White House access badge because him and President Clinton weren't even on speaking terms. I mean, they wouldn't even speak to each other. So we've been in the situation, the FBI has been in the situation where the president and the director of the FBI weren't exactly getting along. Different situation. I understand there's differences in those situations, but the core situation where you had an FBI director and a president really at loggerheads, we've been through that. And I think Wason's exactly right. We need stability at the top. We need leadership. We need transparency. As I said earlier, I think we need a change in the leadership at the under executive level. Some of these people whose names have been tarnished rightfully or wrongfully, we need new leadership in there. But I think the director needs to stay on course, stay out of the public debate, stay out of the political arena, and lead us, through this period of time. We've been there before. Agents have seen this. We do our job and we get through these rough times.
All right, and I agree with that. And I think for three old dogs, we seem to agree on quite a bit tonight. Guys, thank you so much. I won't be surprised if I have requests to bring you guys back another time. This was a fantastic conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. I know we didn't get to all your questions, but I just didn't want to interrupt the conversation of my two old colleagues here. I thought they were providing us a lot of education that we needed to understand what was going on. As always, please go to like us on Facebook, Crimes and Times, and please go to YouTube and hit that little bell icon and become a subscriber. We're getting closer and closer to that magic 100 number, which will increase the number of platforms we could broadcast on. Thank you, everybody. Have a really great night. We'll see you next week. And I'm Michael Tabman from Crimes and Times. Good night.